Hi, I am your host, Claire, and with me today are Jen, Peeples, and Tracie Harris. My cheese has been moved a little bit because I'm not used to this computer. Anyhow, this is Godless Bitches 2.0, Episode 8, Season 4. I think I've got that right. It is September 1st, 2018. And later, in a little bit, we're going to have SERAFINA Smith come in as well because we're going to talk about 2 books about race. I am wearing this hat because we are getting on our Austin deal today. I've got the Blue Bonnet cup as well here. Just to remind people, we do come from the Atheist Community of Austin. We are a nonprofit, an educational organization dedicated to the separation of government and religion and the promotion of positive atheist experience. Let's come on down here for a little bit. The announcements that I have are that the Bat Cruise is actually full, but there is still room at the lecture. Mandisa's going to be talking, and it's going to be awesome. Don't miss that. And then Matt Dillhunty's going to do a magic show in the morning, and he keeps grousing about the fact that it's in the morning. I don't know what time it's going to be, but apparently it's too early for him.
I think it's 10.
10, which is too early for him.
Yeah. I think 10 to noon. And then we take a break and we come back for Mandisa's lecture.
Awesome.
After.
Yeah.
Do we know if she's going to be on the show? Will she be on the Sunday
Yes,
show?
she's going to be on the Sunday show as well.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, that'll be great. And let's see, any other, there are 2 new programs that the ACA is putting out, and be sure to check them out. There's Parenting Beyond Belief every Saturday at 12:30 Central Time, and then the Secular Sexuality, I mess that up every time, is another show that we started up too. And SERAFINA Smith is actually one of the hosts of that show, so she can tell you more about that when she's on. Announcements. You two have anything to?
I think so.
No, I don't think so.
Nothing's going on. All right. So, come on. Right. Okay. So, at this point, you want to talk about your book, and we can get SERAFINA on the line,
Okay.
so that she can tell us about her book. SERAFINA, are you there? Okay.
Okay.
We'll wait for a little bit, but go ahead,
All right.
Jen.
Yeah, I'll talk about this. So the book I've been reading is The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. And they've got that up on the screen for us now. So basically, this is a book that casts slavery in a way that I had never heard of before. And what I can tell you is that the history of slavery that most of us are taught in school is a sanitized version of it. You know, yeah, sure, slavery's bad, but, you know, according to conventional wisdom, the peculiar institution, as it was called, was confined to the South. And there are even people who, they make the claim that it really wasn't very economically beneficial, which is a bizarre claim to make. But in fact, it was not confined to the South. It poisoned everything it touched, and it touched the entire global market. And Baptist's book lays this out in a very convincing case, and basically that capitalism, especially American capitalism, was born from slavery. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to do here is not give you kind of the Cliff's Notes version of the entire book. What I really want to do is kind of tease you a little bit and get you interested in reading the book for yourself.
Right. And I am already, so.
And it's well worth your time, even though the sheer inhumanity of the topic makes it difficult to read at times. Mm-hmm. And so just so everybody knows, I'm not really going to talk about some of the aspects of the book that might be more triggering to people. Because I think people understand the idea of putting a human being on a market and selling them as property is a pretty horrific thing. And of course, there was also physical abuse, sexual abuse, and all that stuff. The things I want to talk about today, I want to specifically focus on 2 chapters of the book. And I want to do that because I think they resonate with some current events. And I'm going to introduce these actually in reverse order. So Chapter 8, which Baptists calls blood, in this case, blood refers not only to ties of blood or kinship. These were tenuous among enslaved people anyway, but it's also the blood from the whipping machine in quotes. And this was the methods of torture that were used to extract more and more increases in productivity on cotton plantations. So I'm going to introduce this with a little story for you. So imagine an era of a booming economy in which opportunity to acquire wealth seems endless. And credit is plentiful, and there's a high demand to invest in this market. And for the price of just $500, an investor can purchase a bond. And these bonds are based on asset-backed securities and are also guaranteed by the government. So where have we heard this before? So the risk is perceived to be low, which creates a moral hazard. Moral hazard being that there's no built-in disincentive to take extraordinary risks, especially when you're dealing with other people's money. Okay? So the influx of investor money means that banks can lend more. So it frees up capital for the banks. And that fuels demand for even more of these asset-backed securities. Okay. Lax regulation means there's little to check the creation of a market bubble. And when the bubble eventually bursts, as they all inevitably do, investors, landowners, and taxpayers are left holding the bill. And the crash causes the failure of markets and financial institutions worldwide. So, if it sounds like I'm talking about the subprime mortgage crisis and the subsequent crash of 2008, I'm not. I'm talking about 1837, and the market that crashed was the cotton market. The cotton market was the largest. Cotton was the largest U.S. export and accounted for some 61% of exports from the U.S. It was literally the commodity that marketed or that made U.S. capitalism what it eventually became. Okay. It was the reason for the forced relocation of Native American tribes to Oklahoma because they needed that land to grow cotton. It was the reason the demand for slaves was so high in the South. Producing cotton using slave labor was, in fact, extremely profitable. So it's not that slave labor was, kind of an artifact of a bygone culture that wasn't really economically feasible. It was hugely economically feasible. In the 1830s, cotton prices rose from 6 cents a pound to 36 cents a pound by 1936, at which point the whipping machine had increased productivity so much that the supply of cotton outstripped the ability of textile mills in Europe to process it. So, of course, the price of cotton fell. But back to those bonds for a minute. So as I mentioned before, these were asset-backed securities. Asset-backed securities derive their value from a pool of underlying assets, and that pool of assets is typically something that can't be easily sold individually. So pooling the assets into financial instruments solves that problem. Okay, so in the 2008 subprime crash, what we saw were the assets that were pooled were mortgages. You couldn't individually sell a piece of a mortgage to an investor, but you could pool them into mortgage-backed securities and sell them to investors. And so, anyway, this allows the investors, even those in faraway markets like New York and London, to purchase a piece of the market. Okay. The asset backing these securities in the 1830s wasn't cotton. It was the slaves themselves. They were the assets backing the bonds that had been packaged into these financial instruments. And the $500 price of the bond was set based on the average price of a slave in the early 1830s. In other words, human beings were commoditized and sold as investments in the market in the 1830s. Okay. So, of course, when the market crashed, what do people do? They sell their assets, which means families were sold away from each other. It was a pretty bad deal. So the point I'm going to make here is that this isn't worse. The fact that human beings were commoditized. I mean, they were already slaves. That's obviously worse than being sold as an asset-backed security to an investor somewhere. What it did was it dirtied the hands of every investor in the world. So if any part of business in the world at that time touched cotton in any way, and it was the first mass-produced consumer commodity, so almost all markets touched cotton in some way.
It's like oil now.
It was tainted by slavery. Yeah. There are certain industries that kind of taint things when they touch them. But anyway, that was cotton. And there were a couple of other things. One of which I want to point out that there have been some studies that have been done on the effects of sexual priming particularly on men's willingness to take financial risks. And what they found is that if you basically prime men with access to women, that they're willing to take more financial risks.
What a shock.
Yeah. And the fact that female slaves were considered to be sexually available to men meant that there was an environment of rampant sexual priming of men with money who would then take financial risks. Another interesting little euphemism that came out of that time was that when the market crashed and people couldn't pay their debts, creditors, of course, came looking for them. And there was one way they could get out of paying these debts. At that time, Texas was not part of the U.S. It was, in fact, a northern state of Mexico, because the Texas Revolution hadn't even happened yet. And so one of the ways that people would get out of paying these debts was that they would relocate to Texas, where they could buy land and go right back into the cotton business as if nothing ever happened. And when collectors came to get these payment on these debts, a lot of times the papers were returned with the letters GTT written on them, which basically meant that was an uncollectible debt. GTT stood for Gone to Texas. So that's where that phrase came from. So people absconded to Texas to get out of paying off their debts after the market crashed. So that's chapter 8 in this book, Blood, which talks about how this poisoned an entire market.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's a weird pragmatic question. It's really not about the morality of it. Mm-hmm. But when the market crashed and they had to sell the assets, which were people, mm-hmm. who was buying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, actually, there were people...
Because you can't give it back to the bank.
Right.
You can't say, like, here's my house, right? I mean, you can't just say, here's a bunch of people.
Right. I guess anybody that had money that was not, that they didn't lose in the cotton market, they were buying the slaves, but they were buying them for, pennies on the dollar. So it wasn't like...
You still have to do something with them. Like, I mean, these are...
Right.
I feel kind of guilty that this is such a pragmatic question, but it's just a curiosity because mm-hmm. it's like the field work, I get the use for these people, and how they were being, used in this capacity. But when you're selling them back, I mean, the first thing I was thinking was when you lose your assets and, now it just goes back to the debtor, right? They mm-hmm. just take your assets. But I guess, oh gosh, it just, I hate the the fact that you have to talk about it in terms of like objective property because
Right.
it's grotesque. It just feels grotesque to talk about it in those terms. But I guess it would be like if you looked at, farm animals as, like, because you wouldn't hand those. I mean, I don't know, does a bank take it and auction it? But even then,
Yes,
someone
they were
has to
sold at
buy it,
auction.
right? Like, but still somebody's going to have to purchase.
Right.
So they were, I guess then the bank would take it back, they would lose money, they would auction, they would sell it off to, I don't know who.
It's probably just like it is now.
weird.
The people with money enough to weather these things would buy low and sell high.
Exactly. And see, the thing is that the price of slaves actually tracked with the price of cotton. So when the cotton market crashed, the slaves weren't worth as
So
much
it had to be
anymore.
somebody that wasn't in cotton, though, because if the reason for the crash was an overabundance of cotton, producing more cotton wouldn't.
I'd like to point something out. I went to the Whitney Plantation. Have you ever been there?
No, I've heard of it.
It's profoundly moving, just thinking about it in the context of this. A lot of the plantations are romanticized, like in Gone with the Wind and so forth. It's set up entirely from the slave's point of view. I'm sorry, the slave's point of view.
Yeah.
And one of the things that and I just did it too, one of the things that they point out is that calling people slaves changes them.
Yes.
They are.
Absolutely.
They are enslaved people.
Yes.
And so I need to watch that. So enslaved people were bought and sold.
Well, and that's one of the things that I like about this book is that Baptist doesn't romanticize plantations. And in fact,
Of course not.
throughout most of the book, he refers to them as slave labor camps, which they were.
It's just so weird, though. I mean, even when I'm sitting here trying to wrap my head around it, and I'm thinking, like, the questions that I'm asking are questions that financial people would have had to ask.
Right.
Right? Like, what do we do with these people?
Right.
I mean, it's like grotesque and absurd all at the same time. Like, you can't even believe that you could have a conversation like that.
Well, and the book doesn't really get into this, but there are other authors who've pointed out that when the transatlantic slave trade was stopped eventually, when somebody said, hey, we can no longer kidnap people from Africa and bring them over here anymore, because that'd be wrong, but we're going to keep the ones we already have in slavery, when that stopped, suddenly the supply of slaves, was cut off. And so at that point in the South, the only way to get more slaves or enslaved people is to breed them. And that's a long-term proposition.
Which is messed up, though, because you could do that. I mean, that's what's so weird is you could do that. You could, like, breed these people.
Right. And that's the
I
thing.
can't even.
And this is the one of the things that gets glossed over. It's like, oh yeah, they had families and everything. It's like, yes, they had families. But think about that for a minute. You could be sold away from your family. Your children could be sold away from you.
Sure.
And there's a story in there about this man who was sold away from his family. And he ended up, I believe it was in like Mobile or something like that. And so he's in another, basically a slave labor camp. And he takes in a 5-year-old boy who was also orphaned by
Same procedure,
the same thing. And he raises this child as his son because he was sold away from his 2 daughters. And that's another one of those really moving points, where you talk about a redefinition of manhood that involves care for other people.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So anyway, so the people that didn't lose everything in the cotton market crash,
It's so weird.
Bought
I can't even.
bought the human beings that were sold as assets to cover the debts, and of course it didn't cover the debts.
It's weird because it's our own history, but it's so
It
foreign.
is. Yeah.
And it makes me, it stuns me that even when we have like strange vestiges of things like that, when this issue comes up in other areas, people aren't immediately appalled.
Yeah.
Like in reproductive rights. You know what I mean? That whole idea of it's okay to force somebody to gestate and birth a child. And I'm listening to this story and I'm just like, this is not okay at all. Like,
Right.
not okay at all. You know, and the thing that made it, what's the word? Like, possible was that they weren't people.
Right.
Right? That's the thing, that they were property and you could do that. But we're talking today about doing that to people that people are trying to say, oh, no, I'm not dehumanizing anybody. I'm not saying they're not a person, but let's just treat them like objects, like property, like state property.
Yeah, like the life support system for the reproductive organs. Yeah. You're not really a person. You're just
you can't simultaneously. It's one of those things where it's like, I know cognitive dissonance means, that feeling of unrest.
Yeah.
When you are aware that you're holding two contradicting ideas. And I don't think that that's what happens with these people. I think that they just hold the contradicting ideas and that it doesn't bother them at all, that they think they say these things and then they think I'm supposed to hear it and believe that they think that I'm actually human. And it's like, no, what you're saying is, you might as well just say to me, Tracie, you're not a human being. You're some sort of object or commodity. And you have no rights to your own body. The state can step in and control that, and that's totally fine by me, but I still respect you as a human being.
Right.
And it's like, no, you don't. You really don't. And when women, are appalled by that or, pull back from that then there are a lot of men who are just like, I don't understand why. I don't understand. It's not like and it's like, because you just told her she's not a person.
Well, and not only that, but that has ties to slavery as well, because control of women's reproduction it's not just like slavery. That was a component of slavery. A woman did not have control, an enslaved woman did not have control of her fertility.
At all.
And in fact, she couldn't even protect her own children from sexual predation by, plantation owners and anybody.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a huge market for light-skinned women in the slave market who were termed fancy. If she was a fancy, that meant she was sexually attractive to white men, and she was basically sold ostensibly as a house servant, but in reality,
because she was in the house.
She was a concubine. And how do you get light-skinned white women or light-skinned enslaved women from an African population? Well, you rape African women.
Right.
That's how you get.
Do you know that there's some early case law where originally the slave trade was based on biblical slavery rules. But what happened was, in the Bible, if you had children by a slave, they were your children.
Yeah.
And so we had a lawsuit. I think it was a female or a woman that was enslaved, and she got an attorney to represent her, and they took it to court and said her father was a freeman, and so she should be a free person. And after that, they changed the laws and said, no, children born to slaves are slaves.
Right.
Which deviated from the biblical model.
Right.
And like suddenly that wasn't good enough because they needed these people to stay slaves.
Well, and that's in Virginia, in Jamestown, in Virginia, initially African people who were brought there ostensibly as slaves were classified as indentured servants. And then later that got changed to they were like permanent apprentices.
Permanent.
And then eventually, like you said, the law was changed so that if your mother was a slave, you were a slave. Full stop.
SERAFINA is on hold, and
Okay.
I would like to go over to her because she's
Get her on.
She doesn't have much time.
Okay.
So then we'll come back.
Yeah, we'll come back
Is
to
that okay?
chapter 7 after she's...
Is that good?
Yeah, let's
Yep.
do that.
All right.
Sure.
SERAFINA, are you there?
Hey, Claire, how's it going?
Good. How are you, woman?
I am doing pretty well.
Good.
Having a nice day.
Good. So you have a book that you want to talk about. Can you tell us the title and author?
Yes, I too am giving a book report today.
Oh, man.
So the book I wanted to talk about, it's called So You Want to Talk About Race, and it's by Ijeoma Oluo. And the reason, so I've been an avid reader my whole life. And so, you know, as many do, I have like thousands of books on my desperately hanging shelves. And, but every once in a while you come across a book that, you know, you close it at the end and you're like, I want to make everyone read this book. And that was what happened when I closed the book here. And it's what it is. It's one of those books that you open it up and you feel like you're just talking to someone. You're having a conversation with someone. It's that kind of accessible book. And it's there to answer your questions for anyone who, especially if you're white, as I am, and want to talk about or know how to engage with conversations about race. And so it goes through, and all of the chapters are based on a question that the author commonly gets or commonly sees, like, you know, what is racism? Why am I always being told to check my privilege? What is intersectionality? What is cultural appropriation? Why can't I say the N-word for Pete's sake? You know, what are microaggressions? What if I hate Al Sharpton? That's literally one of the chapters. What do I do if I get called racist? Why are the students so angry these days? And all sorts of things like that. And so it's really this wonderful favor that this brilliant woman has given to us, because it's doing all the work that we're constantly asking people of oppressed classes and races to do to educate us. And it's doing it in this really accessible way that, so it literally feels like, you know, you're sitting down with your lovely friend who's Black, and you get to ask all those questions, and you get a really good, really understandable education about it from the perspective of stories about her life, and stories from just across the nation.
Which is there any particular point that she gets across to you that really resonates?
So very many. One of the first things that like really lit a light bulb above my head was in like the very first chapter of just, is it really about race? And it's just, you know, what makes something about race? And the ideas were, you know, it's about race if it disappropriately or disproportionately, or differently affects people of color. It's about race if it fits in a broader pattern of that sort of thing. And it's about race if a person of color thinks it's about race. And that one just sort of confused me for a minute. Like, what? I mean, it just sounds like you get to choose and that's it. But she goes on to explain and talking about, you know, when she's followed around in a store by a white clerk, it's about race because regardless of the clerk's intention, she's bringing her entire history of a Black woman who's routinely followed around by staff when she stops in stores. And so even if the clerk isn't thinking of her race at all, even if she's not even really following her, it's about race because
she's not really thinking about race at all. That's what makes it about race, right? It's like it's the inconsideration of the historical and, you know, cultural context of what she's doing. It's just like being completely unaware in a way that is almost inexcusable. There's a level of ignorance that it's like, okay, well, most people don't know this. And then there's a level of ignorance where it's like, everybody knows this. What is wrong with you?
Yeah.
And so when you're treating somebody in a way that you might treat everyone that way, but you understand that this person has a different context and a different history where you need to take some steps, right, to watch what you're saying and watch what you're doing in that regard, and you don't, yes, that's racist.
Yeah.
Yeah, we bring our identities, which include our racial identities, wherever we go. And if we are ignoring that, then we're missing out on a lot of what we're doing to interact with the world.
Well, it's like all the people out there that claim, oh, I don't see color. I mean, that falls into the, okay, you know better, or at least you should know better, because by not seeing color, you're basically negating the different experiences of people of color in society.
Mm-hmm.
You're arguing that they have the same experiences and the same cultural background, everything, as white people. And that's hugely offensive, and it's very racist. Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes me grind my teeth. I was sitting with a work colleague who made that statement at dinner one night, and I thought, I don't know whether to face palm or face plant into, my dinner here, because this is just unbelievably racist.
Well, you know what? It's almost like the point that I brought up early, like in a different show, where I was saying that equality between genders doesn't mean everyone is a man now, and equality between races doesn't mean everybody's white now.
Right.
So when you treat everybody, quote, the same, and what you're doing is treating them like they're white, then you're not really treating them the same.
Right.
Right? And I think the example I used was if somebody's raising children, like you have 3 children, and every time one of them misbehaves, you put them in timeout, which is a small closet with a little light. I mean, it's not, like an abusive closet situation, but it's just a small room where they stay for 10 minutes and then they're allowed out. And you say, I treat all my children the same. I have no sorts of, disparity in how I treat them. But one of those kids, has a terrifying phobia, claustrophobia.
Yeah.
Now you're not treating those kids the same anymore. Now you're traumatizing and terrorizing one of your children, even though you're applying the same metric there.
Right.
And that's what this is about. When you're applying that same sort of I treat everyone equally, but what you really mean is I don't treat them each with equal respect. I simply treat them like I treat whoever and act like they're white or act like they're male, and that should be good enough. And it's like, that's not good enough.
It's almost like the golden rule is wrong. Treat people like you would want yourself treated.
Right. It is wrong. There's a platinum rule. Treat people like they would like to be treated.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, I didn't make it up.
Okay. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I like it.
There's so many little things that are just part of our normal attitudes and our normal behaviors that just they carry these racist things with them without us knowing it. And I grew up, as a white woman who grew up in the late 70s in a mostly white affluent suburb. My notion of what racism was taught to me as it was an intentional thing. It was a prejudice that was, it meant harm, and it wasn't something that I would do, right? It wasn't something that, if someone was racist, it meant that they were, they were a bad person, they were a bigot, and that completely isolated my thoughts for a very long time from the idea that racism could be even associated with me. Like I was a good person,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so
No, there are so many examples, like even in the present headlines, right? Like, there was the governor's race that's going to happen in Florida.
Right.
And we had Gilliam and DeSantis, right? And DeSantis throws down this comment that if you put this Democratic, black opponent in office, you're going to really monkey things up. And that was, in my mind, it sparks this discussion. And to be fair, most people were offended by it. Even conservative, people that spoke were like, I wouldn't have chose that wording, So, but the defense was, of course, this term is not racist. And there are people who are going to say, you use that term with white people, right? And so they're making that same argument that since it's okay to do this or say this to a white person, that makes it totally okay and not racist at all to throw this down to a black person. And it's like, no, man, you're not getting this at all. What made it completely racist was the lack of filter in this guy's head that said, you know, before I use this one of a million phrases to say screw things up, maybe I should like use a different phrase because this is going to look really, really bad.
Well, and DeSantis had previously referred to Gillum as articulate, which is another one of those little, you know.
For a black guy.
Yeah.
Right? Which, I mean, that's what, you might as well just tack it on with an asterisk.
Yeah.
Place.
I mean, and this reminds me of, you know, in 2008 when Obama was running and someone referred to him as articulate. And I'm sitting here thinking,
Really?
it's like, okay, this dude was a Harvard law professor. You know, of course he's articulate.
Yeah.
Can we like find another word to talk about him?
I'll tell you what, though, I have heard Gillum speak, and he's pretty impressive.
He is very impressive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
I would not describe him as articulate. I would describe him as inspiring.
yeah.
Yeah.
But his comments are, you know, well, I mean, there were things that he said when I was watching him speak that I was kind of surprised. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't believe you want to step into that, you know, pile of poop.
Yeah.
Because that's something that's going to get a lot of backlash. But I mean, basically, even though I might have agreed with him, I would be like, I don't know if I would have said that because that's going to be controversial. But that, you know, that's him, I guess. And he's not afraid to say, you know, hey, even though this doesn't affect my race, you asked me about it, instead of saying it doesn't affect my race and I don't need to go down that rabbit hole of you know, what's going to happen if I say this.
Yeah.
He would just, you know, say it. So it's like he seems like a person that's not afraid of controversy, that's it's okay owning his opinions.
Yeah.
And I really was like, wow, that's something you don't see.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope we see a lot more of him.
Yes, indeed.
Not that we're telling anybody who to vote for.
No.
No.
Expression of personal preference here. I just like seeing inspiring people out there, you know, working for
like
the people.
Thinking people.
Yeah.
Someone who's
It's
willing
a nice change.
Right?
Yeah.
But anyway, that was an example, like a current events example of what you're talking about. Somebody that tries to say, well, that, you know, I would use this phrase no matter what. And it's like, yeah, but you shouldn't use it here
Yeah.
for really obvious reasons.
You're an idiot.
Yeah.
God. Oh, man.
To conclude my book report,
All right.
by Sarah Smith, age 11. Near the end in her "But What If I Hate Al Sharpton" chapter, which delights me, just the name of the chapter.
Right.
She includes this wonderful list that it's probably my favorite part. And it's just, if you're a white person concerned with fighting racial oppression and you want to avoid like tone policing behavior and stay focused on being an ally, some things to remember. And these were just so useful to me. So she says, be aware of the limits of your empathy, because your privilege will keep you from fully understanding the pain being caused to people of color by systemic racism. But just because you can't understand it, that doesn't make it not real.
Right.
Don't distract or deflect. The core issue in discussions of racism and systemic oppression will always be racism and systemic oppression. And I've seen people violate that one a lot.
Yeah.
Remember your goal. Your main goal, if you consider yourself an ally, should be to end systemic racism in whatever ways you can. Drop the prerequisites. That goal shouldn't have any preconditions on it. You're fighting systemic racism because it is your moral obligation, and that obligation is yours as long as systemic racism exists, pure and simple. If you're putting conditions on it, then you're doing something else. Walk away if you must, but don't give up. If you simply can't abide an oppressed person or group's language or methods, step aside and find where you can help elsewhere.
Right.
And this is probably my favorite one. Build a tolerance for discomfort. You must get used to being uncomfortable and get used to this not being about your feelings if you plan to help and not hinder people of color in their efforts for racial justice. And just that in itself, just that one part, be tolerant of discomfort. I mean, how many times have I seen a otherwise promising discussion go off the rails because suddenly the person, usually a white person, feels like they're not,
Right.
like maybe they're not being respected, or
Right,
it's not
they take
about
it
them
personally.
anymore, or
And they do
personal
the,
stuff.
you know,
like
not
about
all white
you.
people. And I mean, I've been there, so I know how easy it is to basically fall into that trap. And so, I mean, I've had to do that kind of work myself and learn to accept feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, and it's an opportunity for self-examination.
I just think it's easier if you just own it, right? So when somebody is just like venting and they're just like, man, why do white people blah, 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 blah? And I think, man, I wouldn't do that. Instead of saying, hey, not all white people, I wouldn't do that, I say, you know, I agree that is completely wrong. And I think it sucks that, yeah, white people do that, right? It's like, because we do. And I understand that I'm being lumped in. And you know what? I'm big. It reminds me of that quote in I can't remember his name right now. And it pains me because he's like one of the greatest American poets. But that idea of being big enough, that I'm big, that I can contain multitudes, right? And so the whole idea of saying, from the place that this person's coming from, I should be big enough to absorb that. And I should be big enough to suck that up and say, you're right, white people do this and it's completely wrong.
Right.
Yeah. One
And
instance.
it's uncomfortable. It's difficult. It's not easy.
Yeah. One instance where it's particularly uncomfortable is with people with whom you have relationships that are not easily pushed. Family and so forth who are bigoted. So.
Oh gosh, none of us have people like that in our family.
None. Yeah. See, that's
Oh, no.
it's a lot easier for me if it's a friend or maybe an acquaintance or even a stranger sometimes. But with that person that you have to maintain the relationship and maybe you're not quite close enough that you can just like lay it out on the line. We all have relatives, we can do that, but there's a tricky line to walk. And
This is why I don't talk to my relatives.
right. I personally do push the line a little bit each time. Like if they say something that I'm like, that's not cool. They're not called Mexicans. They're called Latinos or Hispanics, sort of thing. Just a little bit. It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Well, unless they're from actual Mexico, in which case.
Well, no, in this particular instance was not what they
The
meant.
cool thing is relatives eventually die like one by one. You get less and less of them as you get older, so you have less of this to worry about.
Yeah,
It's kind of a nice perk. But
The silver lining is that
Oh God, it's funny because
I speak only for my own family. I know there are some people who are, might be going through the loss of family, and this is maybe not funny.
No, right.
So I am
get
not
it.
speaking for everyone, and I understand that some people love their family, and that's good for
right?
them.
And and then there are those of us who prefer our family of choice.
Yeah.
And
I also liked your the step aside comment, right? Like there are so many times when people are like, but I don't want to step aside. I want to stay and tell you why you're wrong and why you're not doing it right and how you could do it so much better. And it's like, yeah, you're only about the 1,000,000th and 10,000th and 14th person to tell them that they're doing it wrong and that they could be and they're doing it the way they're doing it, And yeah, I mean, if it bothers you, you're right. There's other things you can go help with. Like go be a positive force in a group that you can actually positively contribute to instead of sitting in the group that you're completely discontent with and fighting them about how to proceed so that nothing moves forward. That is not helpful.
Yeah, and the thing that I find most infuriating about people that want to tell other people that you're doing your activism wrong on some level is that most of the time these people don't do any kind of activism that actually puts them on the line, puts their, they don't take risks in any sense. And I'm sorry, but showing up at Pride once a year, that's not taking a risk.
No.
We've pretty much taken all the risks for you, and you're just there for the party. But and so they're gonna tell oppressed people how to handle their own oppression. And then when they're told, hey, look, we tried being nicer. Never in the history of any kind of, oppression has that convinced an oppressor to stop oppressing us. It's always been some kind of more direct confrontation that's pushed them back. And so sit down and shut the fuck up.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like if someone's doing something, let's say they really are doing something wrong that's going to really backfire. You know what? Once they tell you to step off, let them do the thing, let it backfire. They'll figure it out. They'll do it differently next time. And it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Really, it'll be okay. Like, it reminds me of when, like, my friends say they're getting married and there's a part of me that's like, yeah, how long will that last? But I keep that part to myself, right? And so I think to myself, it doesn't really matter because it's happy now, and if it gets unhappy later, guess what? You can fix it. It's not the end of the world, and they don't need to hear my concerns. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Trying to save
They'll
everybody.
figure it out.
Though.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
Such a natural thing to do. It's a natural thing to like try to, shove yourself in and make your.
But all that stuff takes so much work.
I feel like I can fix it.
It's just so much work, though.
It's better. You don't get it.
You have so much more free time if you just stop trying to fix things for every other people. Like really, it's like just let them figure their stuff out. It's like that meme where you got the little guy raising his finger and then he just kind of is like, yeah, no. And that's the thing. It's like just go and have a margarita and sit by the pool, do something fun if whatever it takes. But yeah, you don't have to frustrate yourself trying to fix other people's situations and lives. And when it comes to things that they want to do, right? Like let them do it.
All right. Oh my gosh. So is that the conclusion of your book report, Serafina?
That was the conclusion. Well, the real conclusion is everyone should buy and read this book and give it to your friends. Again, Ijeoma Oluo. So you want to talk about race?
Yeah, they're showing the book cover right now on screen, so people can see it. So yeah, that's cool.
In front of me.
Well, that's fine.
Outstanding.
You can reiterate it.
Thank you so much, Serafina. Do you want to stay on and contribute to the discussion that we're going to have on chapter 7? Was it, Jen?
Yes.
Or do you need to go?
Yeah, my lunch break will be over soon, so I do need to go. But it was really great.
Well, thank you.
Being on with you guys.
Thank you so much. And tell us one more time when Secular Sexuality is on.
Oh, gosh. So I think our first public show is going to be on the 23rd after AXP that day.
Right on. Everybody watch for it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Serafina.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Right on.
All right. Well, that was a good discussion.
It was.
Right.
Great. So, I guess we want to shift gears back
to the...
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back
Chapter
to
7.
Yes, The Half Has Never Been Told, Chapter 7, which Baptists entitled Seed. So, seed literally refers to cottonseed, which was the source of the nation's wealth in the 1700s, and it turned the U.S. from a bit player on the world market to a global market giant. Seed also refers to the source of and the rise of white male anger in the South. And this is something that ties directly into this show and a lot of the stuff we talk about here. The South has a particular flavor of toxic masculinity that is still on display. In fact, we've managed to export it to lots of places in the country that are populated by largely white populations and have lots of angry white males. This particular form of toxic masculinity involves a violent response to any perceived threat to masculinity, and it's particularly prevalent among poorly educated, economically disadvantaged white males. There is this rage at, why they are in this situation. And I want to illustrate this with another story, and this one involves a man named Robert Potter. Potter was a white man from North Carolina. He was born into a poor family during a time when being white and male didn't really get you very much unless your family was wealthy. So if your family had wealth and social status, you were good to go. being white and male meant a lot. But if you didn't have the wealth and the social status to go along with that, being white and male didn't mean much. But at least you weren't a slave.
Right.
You know, you could always go through life knowing that you were better than a slave. And this gets to be important here when we talk about Potter. So Potter was ambitious, and he managed to gain the favor of a wealthy man who secured an appointment for him as a midshipman. So he served for a stint in the Navy. When he got out of the Navy, he went back to North Carolina, and he decided to run for office. Well, he didn't have high social status or money, and so the plantation owners and the social elite aligned against him and supported another man for this particular elected office. This man's name was Jesse Bynum. So Potter was defeated. So he felt betrayed by what he thought were his wealthy patrons. And he felt that his dignity had been insulted, so he challenged Bynum to a duel. Dueling was permitted to wealthy men back then as a way to settle like insults to honor, everything. So these honor-based cultures, you see this over and over again, where any insult to honor is something that you should respond to with violence.
Well, there's actually a lot of current research on Southern
Yeah.
honor culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, that still goes on. I mean, they're not like having duels, but
Yeah.
there's still the honor culture, like and perceptions of insult and violent reactions are higher and lower in different peoples in different regions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, Bynum refused because you don't duel with your lessers.
Sure.
And so he considered, you know, Potter to be his social inferior, and he wouldn't duel him. Well, Potter decided that that was an even greater insult, so he ambushed Bynum one night and cracked him over the head with a stick.
There's the honor in that. It's like,
So he defended his actions by claiming that his manhood had been insulted, and that he was entitled to defend that. And he was never prosecuted for the assault.
that's bizarre.
But the mere threat of prosecution, because again, he didn't have the social status that allowed wealthy men to defend their honor. But the mere threat of prosecution was, it was just like this perceived insult that fueled his anger at things in general.
So now he's getting madder and madder.
So,
guy's-
so the next election...
This is the days before anger management therapy.
Yeah.
So people understand the context here.
So he ran again in the next election against Bynum, and he won. So then he went on to win a seat in Congress in 1828 and again in 1832. But before that 1832 election, something interesting happened. In 1831, he suspected that his wife was sleeping with a minister and a teenage neighbor. Okay?
Wow.
So both of these were regarded as his social superiors. So
More insults to his manhood.
that's right. Exactly.
Okay.
His poor manhood.
And of course, if he challenged them to a duel, they might publicly refuse, which would publicly
Yeah.
humiliate
We know
him
how that goes.
again.
Yeah.
So he came up with a novel way of settling the dispute. He decided that the way to avenge his honor was to kidnap them, castrate them, and release them. So he did that.
Holy cats.
Yes. He was caught within like a day, and from his jail cell, he defended his actions by saying that it was self-defense. That by cuckolding him, these two men had tried to unman him. And so, in other words, they had treated him like a slave. And the only thing he could do to restore his honor and erase the insult was to commit an act of even greater violence.
And this guy was like a congressional representative, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this happened in 1831. Bear in mind, he was reelected to Congress in 1832.
Did he keep his seat?
Well, he ended up going to prison for 2 years. He only served 2 years because there was no criminal offense on the books in North Carolina at the time for castrating a white man. So he only served 2 years, I guess, for the kidnapping charge. And then he was released again. And you would think
I
that,
bet they fixed that law.
yeah.
So to speak.
Well, they did. And it coined a term. It coined a term called potterizing people. Potterizing became a euphemism for
Wow.
either actually or symbolically castrating
And he only spent 2 years.
a man. Yeah.
Did he ever go back to Congress?
No, but he continued to be like a hero to poor white men. You would think that this would make him a pariah.
I was going to make a joke about I could castrate 2 guys in,
Yeah.
full public view and still not lose a
Yeah.
vote. But I guess he, probably couldn't get the votes again. Although you're saying people loved it.
They did.
Wow.
He became like a hero to these poor white men who thought he was their champion because, he castrated these 2 social superiors and, he showed them. And so this was sort of the sentiment that was brewing in the South at the time, that these poor white men decided that, in order to not be treated like slaves, you had to react violently to any perceived insult, to the point of even killing people.
But if you're actually enslaved, don't even think
That's
about
right.
it.
You can't offer violence at all.
Don't even think about it.
And in fact, the people who tried to escape or lead revolts against slavery, when they were pursued by the hounds and caught, the people pursuing them would immediately instruct them, if you so much as hit one of those dogs, I'll beat you within an inch of your life, or I'll kill you right here. They were not even allowed, and the dogs are biting them because these are not, I don't know if you have much experience with bloodhounds. They tend to be portrayed as like sweet and nice, and they're really not.
Sleeping on the porch.
They
when
are-
I'm not tearing a bear apart.
So these hounds were like biting them, and they were not even allowed to kick out at the dog or anything like that. They were told to stand still and cover your privates with your hands.
Unless you want to be potterized.
That's right.
Man, this whole thing is just...
And so this was the context that you had the social elite at the top, all white. You had the poor white people in the middle, and there was such a huge disparity between, how they were regarded in society.
Wow.
And
I'm
then you
so
had the-
glad society is like so different now.
Yeah,
That we've
yeah.
really, really adjusted all of that.
And then you had, slaves at the bottom.
Wow.
And the people, the white people, poor white people, instead of looking at the wealthy planters and saying, hey, you guys have created a really fucked up system, their idea was, well, at least I'm not a slave. And so they basically turned on what should have been their natural allies. And of course, wealthy planters used that to their advantage later on, especially during Reconstruction, but even like during the Andrew Jackson administration.
Still now.
Yeah, and still do, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Jackson, man, that's a whole
yeah.
show unto itself.
It is.
And I just want to tell, if you're one of those people who thinks that Trump is like the worst thing that's ever happened to the country, you might want to go read up on Andrew Jackson, because
yeah.
he was like the next level of what happens when a president finally says, I don't really care about the law, and I don't care who knows it, and SCOTUS can go eat cereal because I'm going to do what I want to do. I own the military. What are you going to do? Stop me, right? I mean, that was Jackson.
Yep.
And the people that are afraid of what would happen under Trump, it did happen under Jackson.
Yeah.
It did happen.
Yeah. Well, and you'll be not surprised to know that Potter actually was a strong supporter of Jackson.
Jackson was a piece of work, and he's still on the money.
I know.
That's what kills
I know.
me. He's still on the $20 bill. I'm like, how? How? He just like thumbed his nose at the Constitution, the law, the American treaties. I mean, he did not care about rule of law at all.
Yeah.
Complete rebellion against the nation, basically.
Yep.
And he's he's on the 20.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Isn't he going to be replaced?
They keep talking
Yeah, they
about
keep
it, but
talking
it
about
doesn't happen. Right?
Yeah,
It doesn't happen.
it's going to happen so far in the future that I thought, I hope I live to see it.
Yeah.
was the last date I saw.
Jackson was to the Native Americans what the Robert E. Lee statue is to Black Americans,
Right.
right? I mean, Jackson was that guy.
Oh, and it is.
Acting illegally, genocidal,
Yeah.
on a rampage.
Yeah. And I will like go on record and commit heresy in the South here and tell you that Robert E. Lee was a shitty general.
Well, he lost, didn't he?
Well, yeah, but, I mean, even good generals can lose, but he was actually kind of a shitty general. So
Jen was in the military, so she knows these
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
yeah. So
Right.
anyway,
Excuse me. Wow. What time is it?
it is 12:01.
It is time. So, in 2 weeks, there will be another Godless Bitches, and on that one, we will be telling you how to start your own group. If you are the only you think you're the only atheist in your area, I doubt it. And it's pretty clear that a lot of people think that there's nothing going on around them. Sometimes there is, but if there isn't, we want to talk to you about how you can start your own organization. So with that, I want to thank you, Jen and
Yeah,
Tracie.
Sure thing.
This has been an amazing show.
Yeah, one more plug for the book. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward E. Baptist, and you should get it and read it. It's sometimes a difficult subject, but well worth your time.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to read it now. And I would like to thank Mark, Vern, and Phil in the other room for doing such an amazing job. They do all the hard work of making this actually happen, and that's the same for any other production you see that the Atheist Community of Austin produces. And with that, I'd like to say we don't need a savior. We have each other. It's all we have, and we've ever had, and it's all we'll ever need.